in terms of research or other sort of activities. And so we really wanted to try to have a place to talk about connectivity issues and communication issues. And we did sort of strive to invite people that are actually dealing with connectivity topics in the state of Alaska. And this date didn't work out well for those folks, so we'll try that at another time. But we did also want to have a discussion around sort of how people are communicating now during the pandemic, because there's all kinds of challenges with that. So how people are adapting to that. And then through that process, are we actually learning some new or better ways potentially to communicate? Or are we also sort of bumping up against some of those sort of infrastructure and connectivity issues that have been brought up in the past? So we thought this would be a good place and time to talk about these sort of things. So we've asked 3 people to participate today and share their perspectives. There wasn't a requirement for presentations. It was more just sort of a short update to give us of what they've been working on and what's been working well. Because we also wanted to provide an opportunity for people that are calling in to provide a similar sort of perspective, because we know there's so many different things happening right now, and we wanted to understand what other folks are facing and maybe some of the things that they're learning. So I think there's 2 questions there on the agenda on the screen right now, or sort of the questions that we posed of the folks that are gonna talk today. And certainly we'd like to hear from others on these 2 topics. And those are sort of what tools are people finding useful right now for adapting to this online and virtual communication world that we live in? What's working well, and maybe what do we need to improve upon for best information access by stakeholders? And by that, I mean, not just currently, but sort of going into the future, because we all are very concerned about communication and the activities that we do. And so what I'd like to do is introduce Patty Schwalenberg next. So she'll be the first person to provide some perspectives for us on what she's working on with a group called the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council. And I'm gonna put their webpage in the chat box here. Let's see. So this is a relatively new website that Patty and others have developed, and it's really full of great information and a lot of good information about how this group came to be. But briefly, it was formed in 2000, and it consists of members from Alaska Native populations statewide, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And so it's been a very successful group in bringing these different perspectives together to talk about concerns and issues that people have with migratory birds or about migratory birds, share ideas, and then really talk about management strategies that they feel are necessary, and sort of proceed through a rulemaking process and a listening process to make changes that they feel are needed to manage migratory birds. So with that, Patty, I just wanted you to feel free to introduce yourself further and add more information. And then we're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives on communication currently.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me, John. I appreciate it. We at the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council have 2 meetings per year, and they've always been in person, as other people are experiencing. And so we have a spring meeting and a fall meeting. In the spring meeting, we held via teleconference. And so the most useful tool actually has been teleconferencing for us, because we have 10 Native partners, a state partner and federal partner. And a lot of the people now, especially during COVID, aren't even in their offices, they are at home. And so they may not have a personal computer, they may not have internet at home. And so we chose that route for the spring meeting. For the fall meeting, I think we're going to try Zoom with teleconferencing capabilities, so that people can either call in or Zoom to see the screen and the slides for the presentations. But in that instance, then they'll have to be sending out the presentations via email to each of the participants, which isn't always the best either. But that's kind of what we're finding, is the teleconferencing is the go-to platform at this point. Most everyone has Zoom that has access to the internet or has a good internet connection. but not Microsoft Teams. That one is, we require, what is it, Microsoft or Office 360. And a lot of the tribes and tribal organizations don't have that. So what we've been doing as a workaround with the federal agencies that we partner with, such as the Fish and Wildlife Service, they can't initiate a call on Zoom, but we can as a partner. So we'll initiate the call and then they can participate. But if they initiate a call, it has to be on, as far as I know, on Microsoft Teams. And so we're always having to contact people and see if they have it. And most of the time they don't. So it seems to be Zoom seems to be the go-to video conferencing platform that seems to work for the rural communities. We've not tried GoToMeeting or WebEx, so I really can't comment on those two. We also have a contract with the Fish and Wildlife Service to put on a week-long immersion training called Alaska Native Relations. And that training provides tools for federal employees. It started with just the Fish and Wildlife Service, and now it's all Department of Interior employees can attend. But it provides information on Alaska Native, the cultures, the history. We provide training on cross-cultural communication, the laws that affect Alaska Natives, and then more practical things like, you know, what happens when you go to a village, or what is an elder. And we have, generally we have an elder from each culture group participating in the class, sitting amongst the students the entire week. So they have that interaction and that indigenous knowledge that's shared throughout the week. So this year we were tasked with putting it online. And so we used Zoom again. And the good thing about Zoom was we were able to record the presentations. So students who were not able to participate for that day were able to go back and watch the presentation. And instead of having 45 students, we put on two trainings, one's 45 and one's 90 in person. This time we had over 100 students from across the country, from Baltimore to the Aleutians, participating in the training. So that was kind of fun, being able to see where everyone was from and that they were interested in learning about what we were offering. So the challenges that we had during that, and not the AMBCC meeting because that was all teleconference, but was solid internet connectivity for the people that were participating from remote areas. That was an issue. Some of the elders, we actually had elders participate in the training, and some of them did not have internet availability, or they didn't have the technological capacity or capability to participate. In other words, they didn't know how to run Zoom, or they didn't know anything about video conferencing. Excuse me. So we had to spend some time with those participants, getting them ready so that they could meaningfully participate in the class. And the other challenge that we had was, since this class was held this past summer, a lot of the Alaska Native participants are busy outside catching fish and getting their food for the winter. And so that was, the participant availability was also a bit of a challenge. Let's see. So for, I guess, lessons learned, if that's what we want to call it, we had to make sure we checked with everyone so that they could use that particular platform, Zoom in our case, that we were proposing. We tried to accommodate as many rural communities as possible. And again, if you are speaking with or including Alaska Native elders, to make sure someone is available to help them with the phone system or the video conferencing system, or helping them to sign on or operate some of the features. And checking back often with the participants to make sure they could hear everyone else, or if they could see what was on the shared screen. That was oftentimes an issue. People would just get frozen or weren't able to hear and couldn't let us know that they couldn't hear. So just checking back is always something that's helpful. And like I said earlier, offering teleconference capability along with whatever video conference platform you're using, so that everyone, or as many people as you can have participate, can. And as a host of a meeting, I highly recommend just taking some time on YouTube or wherever to train yourself on how to run an effective video meeting, how to run Zoom or WebEx or whatever it is. And that saved us a lot of time. And I noticed on your getting ready to attend this meeting, you are well organized and ready to attend video conferencing or to participate in video conferencing. So you probably know a lot more than I do with my limited experience, but that's kind of what we've experienced this year, and we're hoping to tweak the practices that we have so far so that it works much better in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patty, for that summary of sort of what you all are doing and what you're finding working and sort of what some of the solutions and lessons learned are. Are there any questions for Patty right now? So Patty, maybe one for me really quick. So just going forward, it sounds like you were able to include more participants in the training. Is that something you're thinking of doing if we get sort of through the pandemic, is continue to include people through video conferencing as well, just so more people can attend?
Yeah, it seemed to work real well, and people were appreciative, like especially from the refugees who weren't able to come to Anchorage for the in-person training previously, were now able to participate. And since we were recording the sessions, they were able to participate on their own time schedule. So that worked really well. So we're in discussions right now about continuing this platform versus, or even in conjunction with an in-person, maybe one distance and one in-person. We're talking about that right now, and I'd be interested to hear from the others how they're operating their meetings. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think there'll be time afterward too for questions and comments. So the next person that we asked to provide an update is Roberto Delgado with National Science Foundation. And Roberto and Colleen Strawhacker worked together on the new program that maybe Roberto will talk about, but we posted in the chat earlier. That's called Potential Support for Community Hubs for Collaborations between NSF funded Arctic researchers and Arctic residents. And there was a meeting on that yesterday, which the recording is also posted in the chat box. So Roberto, I'll turn it over to you. And I don't know if you're going to speak specifically about that or some other programs too, but feel free to start.
Great, thank you, John. And for those of you who don't know me, again, I'm a program director in the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs. I direct the Arctic Observing Network, and along with Colleen and several other of our NSF colleagues, also engage in a working group for navigating the new Arctic, which is actually one of the programs I'll focus a little bit more in terms of the communication aspects. The Dear Colleague Letter, we had the webinar yesterday. We've already been getting a lot of buzz on that. We don't have too much to say about how we're communicating about that right now. So I'll come back to that perhaps a little bit later with questions and answers. For my brief remarks, I want to just sort of cover the context or the role of the National Science Foundation. Is a major federal funding agency, so one of the leading funders of Arctic research. And we, since early mid-March, have completely converted to Zoom platform for primarily internal meetings, as well as most of our external communications. Within the internal sort of scope, that means our staff meetings, different cross-directed initiatives like the Navigating the Arctic Working Group, for example, and our bread and butter, which are merit review panels for evaluating proposals and then subsequently making recommendations for awards, have all again been virtual. Certainly, I think there are different constraints by limiting participation on review panels where we really bring together different expertise from around the country to provide inputs and insights on perspectives for recommendations. But at the same time, also been able to increase participation by some subsets of individuals who may not have been able to travel because of childcare or other responsibilities in their home institutions. And so I think we're sort of balanced out in the sense that you miss out on a few of the sort of little sidebars or in-person types of engagement dynamics. But the way that we've structured the virtual panels, for example, has worked relatively successfully for us. Again, one of the things that is key is really sort of planning ahead, providing a lot of information, a lot of resources well ahead of time. And I'll return to this theme as well in another comment I'll make. With respect to some of our intra-agency communications, which NSF is the chair of IARPC and very actively involved in many different facets, from developing the next 5-year Arctic research plan to having helped revise the principles for conducting research in the Arctic. Zoom works relatively well, although some agencies aren't allowed to use that platform, and representatives from those agencies have to call in. And so that changes a little bit the dynamics of engagement and participation by some agencies. When other agencies are leading some of these interagency groups, sometimes we switch a platform. For example, I'm involved in an interagency group around Arctic observing, and that we've now started using Google Meets, and that brings a different set of individuals who are able to participate and engage more effectively. But sort of the core of my remarks are going to be within the context of a principal investigators meeting that NSF and the Navigating the Arctic program convened earlier this spring in mid-April. Originally, this was supposed to be an in-person meeting in the Alexandria, Virginia region, but given the pandemic and public health and travel restrictions, we quickly pivoted and converted it to an online meeting with over 100 individuals. And again, there was a downside of not bringing people together to have those sort of sidebars and face-to-face types of dynamics, but it did also increase the number of individuals who were able to participate, again, because some had anticipated being on travel or being elsewhere or having other responsibilities, but modifying it so that it was an online format and reducing sort of the time frame for the duration of the meeting allowed increased participation. But as I said, with respect to, for example, the review panels that we convene at the National Science Foundation, we were very fortunate. We had a contractor, so as a funding agency, we have some additional resources that perhaps smaller organizations do not have, and we're able to work with the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, or ARCIS, to really develop, design, and work very diligently. A number of dedicated individuals put in a lot of time and effort well ahead, in the weeks leading up to the meeting, to develop background materials, including project summaries, and we did short videos of different projects that were going to be highlighted. In the end, we had a really nice program book that was sort of follow along with the meeting, that had links to some of these resources. We had documents related to knowledge co-production, community engagement. We invited a number of Alaska Native representatives to participate and speak to us about their experiences. And we really designed the actual content and format of the meeting to be more, very engaging, breakout sessions, interactive prompts, where people were discussing and not just sitting listening to a sequence of speakers over the course of several hours. We built in breaks. It's very, given that we're spending most of the time sitting in front of our screens and monitors, as opposed to, even if we have back-to-back meetings, we used to at least get up and move to a different, well, at NSF, we used to get up and move between different floors, different conference rooms, but now we don't even have that option most times. So, having again, a good, clear plan tended to be a good practice for us. These prompts for breakouts, we had some trained facilitators and use other tools, including Google Docs, for example, for document sharing, for note taking, and then further dissemination. So I think that worked really well in that context. The other aspect that I'll just touch on briefly in my last minute or so is, how do we continue at NSF and within the section of Arctic Sciences to communicate about different Arctic activities, like our Dear Colleague letter, like new solicitations around doctoral dissertation improvement grants. The NSF website tends to be the principal source, and as do the different NSF social media accounts. There's NSF Twitter, NSF Facebook. In addition, we have an OPP Facebook, Office of Polar Programs Facebook account as well. And we certainly rely very heavily on the IARPC Collaboration's website through updates, webinars like Colleen and I convened yesterday, as well as different listservs, including Arctic Info, or providing information to the Arctic Daily Update that is put out by the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and just trying to maximize the different ways in which we communicate, principally to our principal investigators, and then secondarily, I think, to prospective principal investigators and other organizations and local communities throughout the Arctic, for which, through which we support in science policy and research. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thanks, Roberto. Any questions at this time for Roberto?
I'll just note that Cuba from Arcus put a link in the chat with some of the resources that we utilize for the NNAPI's meeting. Thank you, Cuba.
Yeah, and Roberto, if I can ask a question. So I was just curious, through all the announcements you've done recently on the website, have you had any comments back about maybe files that are difficult to download for some groups or people? Any tactics that you all have come up with to make maybe files smaller in size or anything like that to improve access?
I haven't heard anything formally. I don't know if Colleen or I'm not sure if other NSF program officers are on. Usually we're fortunate to have our own communication specialist within the Office of Polar Programs. She works directly with NSF's Office of Legislative and Public Affairs. I think they try to be cognizant and limit file sizes on different types of announcements and attachments, especially I'm familiar a lot of residents in the state of Alaska, use Facebook, for example, or rely on their phones much more than a computer typically. And so I think we are trying to mitigate those constraints to the best possible.
All right, thanks. All right, well, let's move on. Next, we have a sort of update or perspective from Rosie Masui, who's with the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And Rosie coordinates a really impressive long-term harmful algal bloom community monitoring network and program. And that supports and monitors communities from Lower Cook Inlet through Prince William Sound in Alaska. And also more recently, they've begun supporting a monitoring program on St. Paul Island. And so I'm gonna post a link in the chat box for that program. And turn it over to Rosie to give us an update and some perspectives on how they're communicating with all their different groups and monitoring members.
Great, thanks, John. Just for folks who are following along online, I did post a presentation. It's a little bit more in depth, talking about a little bit of background about who we are at the Research Reserve. And if folks have any questions for me, on the last slide of that presentation is my email and contact information. So if you have any questions about the reserve, feel free to reach out. So like John mentioned, I have been facilitating the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network calls for over the past year. For those of you who are not familiar with the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network, this is a network that was formed in 2016, really got going in 2017 with this goal of taking a statewide approach to monitoring, research, outreach and education, and especially event response for harmful algal blooms in Alaska. Previously, that had not really been done, and it was really, really challenging to get support if you were dealing with a new event around harmful algal blooms within the state, even though there were folks working on these issues. This program has been supported primarily by the Alaska Ocean Observing System as well. So what we've been doing now, we've been meeting and started since 2017 and have really kind of formally gone into this mode of doing these monthly call-ins as of a little over the last couple of years. I've taken over the facilitation and have been doing that for a little over the past year, and our monthly calls typically consist of using the Zoom platform, and we have have folks call in and join us, and it is focusing first on doing introductions and then going from introductions to doing round robins. One of the things that we found really helpful is doing those introductions, even though we can have sometimes of over 40. I think we've had at most, especially with some of the intense events around harmful algal blooms that have happened in the state, up to 60 this summer calling into our calls. But what we find is that it's really helpful to have folks do introductions so you get a good grasp on who's on the call, which communities are participating, especially for those who are sharing information. After we do introductions, then we go around and do round robins. And so that's just for folks who have any updates on monitoring or research or any sort of events that have happened. Outside of those monthly calls, we also do working groups. And so we have those under those kind of main topic areas. So monitoring, event response, research, and those meet separately. And then if we are working on collaborating on a proposal, or if a specific event is impacting folks around the state, we will host a special session. We did one of those recently around the recent event. So some of the things that we found really useful, especially recently, is just having this virtual platform to connect with. You know, the fact that we've been connecting via Zoom and doing those round robins and introductions has been really helpful, especially, I'm not sure who all is aware of, but this year, for the first time in over a decade, there was the first fatality in the state of Alaska from harmful algal blooms related shellfish poisoning. So there was a paralytic shellfish poisoning fatality that happened in Unalaska. And it was really, really important for us to have this network in responding to this, especially because typically with a harmful algal bloom event, we partner with the state's Department of Health and Social Services, and they are pretty quick usually. They're able to release a public service announcement warning folks around the state that this is a concern, especially in the area. Typically they do that within a week. And this year, they were not able to release anything for at least a couple of weeks formally. And the reason really was because of the pandemic. But in the meantime, through the network, we were able to provide a lot of support to folks in Unalaska who were trying to respond. And through the network, we were also able to connect some of the folks representing the tribe in Unalaska with folks at NOAA who could potentially provide some emergency event response funding to help collect samples and help do outreach, which was a really, really great opportunity to be able to do. So I think our platform, and one of the things we've found really successful, you know, just kind of looking at that event, is saying that the Zoom and this virtual communication really allows us to provide not only statewide support, but making those national connections. When I first started our monitoring program, working within our monitoring program at the reserve, I was having to track down folks in North Carolina to get support on Alaskan issues, even though there were folks in Alaska working on these issues, just because we weren't able to connect. So working through the network, working through Zoom platforms and emails has been really helpful. Some of the other things that we've run into that I know this meeting, this has been a big issue that this meeting was kind of brought to you about, is dealing with bandwidth issues. So, you know, not everybody can participate in Zoom calls, especially if everyone has their video on, it can really slow things down. So one of the things that's really important is I record all of our sessions, but those recordings are never shared. Those recordings are really just to make sure that I populate the notes, and those who participate in the calls are aware of that. And that's kind of just a mindful and respectful practice. So making sure that folks know that, you know, I'm not actively recording you, but these notes will be kind of concise. Also making sure that the notes are delivered in a timely manner. We hear from quite a few different folks that are not able to participate in our calls, that they still really want those notes and that they still read them. So we get notes out to our different members within a week from our first call. So we found that to be really important as well. One of the things that we're pretty fortunate about, and that I'm very fortunate to have done is the Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve has a lot of support through NOAA's Office of Coastal Management in participating and helping to deliver in Alaska different types of trainings around facilitating meetings that I've been able to do. So folks on this call might potentially be interested in having some support on how to learn some of those facilitation basics. That could definitely be applied to a virtual setting. Please reach out. That's something that we could definitely help arrange or help with. One of the things that I worry about for the future when dealing with some of these different issues is the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network, does these monthly calls, but the building the relationships typically happens in person, either at the Alaska Marine Science Symposium or at the Alaska Forum on the Environment, where we do meetings and workshops or presentations about our network, and we're able to connect in person and kind of build those face-to-face relationships. So I think that's one thing that I just worry about as far as, the virtual engagement is building those relationships and establishing, especially trust, when you're dealing with harmful algal blooms, and there could be something as extreme as a fatality. It's really good to know that you have that trust on the other side of the screen as well. But yeah, that was just kind of a broad overview of what we do, and I'm not sure if anybody has any questions.
Thanks so much, Rosie. That was great. Yeah, and I will say that I often don't have time to attend your meetings, but I do really appreciate the notes, as you mentioned, and typically skim through all of those just to kind of get a quick update from across the state. So yeah, those notes are really helpful. Thanks for doing those. Any questions or follow up to some of the things that Rosie talked about? All right, well, thank you. So now I wanted to sort of open it up to general discussion, but also see if anyone else wants to share sort of some information about the communication tools or methods that you're using right now during the pandemic, and things that you're finding helpful or frustrating, just to sort of a way to start a conversation about how we understand the different tools and maybe what'll be useful going forward, and things that we maybe won't go back to once we're able to sort of meet in person again. So does anyone have any ideas they want to share on communication tools or methods that they're using right now?
So I just wanted to really thank Rosie for the idea of meeting notes. I think that's a really good one. I think it just seems like such a simple thing. I mean, you really need to have somebody who's like dedicated to doing those, right? Because concise meeting notes are not easy to do. And when you're trying to pay attention to 1,000 things, I know that something that I have really thought really deeply about, and I know I'm not the only one, is like, okay, so we have this crisis going on right now on many different levels, and we're forced to communicate in a really different way though. So like, how do we use this as an opportunity to be more inclusive in some ways? And I think just these little things like meeting notes, and Roberto and Kuba talked about the Navigating the New Arctic PI meeting, and now we have like extensive notes on a website that's available to anyone about the outcomes of those meetings. So in some ways I'm trying to see like, okay, like how do we take this opportunity and make our meetings more inclusive? So these little things that just seem so minor, like meeting notes, actually make a huge difference. And all the work that the NNA PI team group and ARCIS did to put those notes out, I think that's just like one of these simple little things that we can really focus on, and something that I just didn't really think that deeply about until I started putting that together. So thanks for bringing that up.
Any other thoughts, comments out there?
Yeah, this is Meredith, and IARPIC hosts a lot of virtual meetings, and we have been for a while. So I resonate with what Rosie said about kind of having that established platform, but also the danger of real relationships and trust being lost, and those introductions being a key component of that, really like spending maybe more time actually connecting as human beings. A couple years ago, IARPC had an internal training for the team leaders that focused on how to connect with people virtually. Just little things like being present, like yourself really being present when you're hosting a meeting, and creating intentionally creating a space for others to be present as well. And kind of, in addition to introductions, maybe adding something outside of the professional sphere into those introductions as well, is another thought. So yeah, continuing to think about how to actually establish real lasting relationships virtually, I think is really interesting.
This is Danielle. I'm so sorry that I had to join this meeting late. But one thing that came up with our Arctic integrated program that we're running is we have folks in remote communities who need to participate in a PI meeting we have coming up that we've had to move to a virtual platform in November. And we have folks in places like Diomede, where the internet is a challenge. And so one of the things that we're thinking about is if cellular data networks are more accessible than the typical Wi-Fi network, can we find a mechanism to provide supplements to somebody to pay for somebody's phone bill so that they can participate in these meetings that way? And I wonder if others are trying to find solutions like that, and if there are established mechanisms, or if some place like, you know, IARPC or ARCIS or something has a mechanism already that we would be able to pass funds through, rather than figuring out a new mechanism as a one-off or something like this.
Yeah, Danielle, that's a really good point. And I think part of like where I really struggle with this conversation is that, you know, it feels like we've been in this situation for like decades. I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but we've really only been in it for what, like 5 or 6 months now, right? And I still think we're learning so much about kind of what the needs are, which are really different for everyone, right? And so like, you know, the people in Diomede need this one very specific aspect, but there are people who are trying to participate in different ways, and they're dealing with subsistence hunting season, and then you know, we're dealing with time zone challenges and things like that. And so I feel like we just need to, it's just really hard for me to wrap around like the absolute diversity of things that we're actually dealing with right now. And bandwidth is just like one aspect. And it's a very important aspect. But I'm just wondering if, you know, and so like, I think, you know, using mechanisms like IARPC and ARCIS are really good to support those things, but I'm wondering if we just can come up with some way to like organize our thoughts about this. It just feels really overwhelming right now.
Yeah, and if I can, I'm sorry I don't know your full name, but JL Curry is putting some really good comments in the chat box. I don't know if you want to talk about those and let me know your first name.
Sure, Jeff Curry. I'm with the Department of Transportation, and yeah, we've been doing a fair amount of telecommuting, not telecommuting, but virtual training and virtual meetings for years due to travel restrictions and other things. So we kind of had a little bit of a head start on it. We adopted the Teams program during the, you know, basically about the same time that COVID hit, and we've also been, at least in my region, here in Fairbanks, we've been spending a fair amount of time on personal development and establishing trust and core values for our organization. So we have a lot of folks who know each other pretty well, and we already had a pretty good set of trust when we started doing the virtual meetings. So it's worked pretty well. And I say Teams is our primary software, but you know, I attend all of them, GoTos and WebExes and Zooms and everything, depending on whose meetings I'm attending. And I find that most of them work fairly well. Yeah, having those relationships pre-established. And that is a challenge now as you start bringing in new people, as you have new folks coming into your organization, or you're meeting with folks that are outside of your organization who you don't already have an established relationship with. But yeah, that's it. There are one example. The Transportation Research Board has a meeting every year, an annual meeting in Washington, D.C. And the Department of Transportation historically has sent half a dozen or 8 people from the whole state there. It's a week-long deal. It's a huge expense. It's a huge, time sink. Well, this year it's going to be virtual, so the potential for many people who normally wouldn't get the opportunity to go is very real. Although we're going to have to manage that. But I say there's a lot of opportunities in this, and I'm certain that DOT and PF and probably everyone else for that matter, we're never going to go back to the pre-COVID, pre-virtual meetings, maybe to some extent, but the technology is here to stay, undoubtedly.
Jeff, that's a really good point. And I just wanted to point out just to what we did, the meeting that Roberto talked about, the NNAPI meeting. Originally, we kind of had to restrict it just based on like numbers and room size that we had access to 1 or 2 people per team. But when we were forced to move virtually, in a relatively quick succession, and Roberto and Arcus did an amazing job kind of within the course of weeks switching from an in-person to virtual meeting. All of a sudden we were allowed to include all of these new people from teams, which meant like grad students could come and undergrad students could listen in, which to me was like this really exciting aspect to moving to the virtual environment. And like, I'm one of those people that I'm like trying to find the positive in it. So that was like this really nice outcome of it. But I do agree that, I was in this really beneficial position that, I would, I know a lot of people already. I spent that time building up those face-to-face, like pre-COVID relationships, but, we've had a number of new people come online at NSF in this virtual environment. And I realized, I think like a couple of weeks ago, that I had never actually had a one-on-one conversation with some of my new colleagues because we just weren't running into each other in the hallway and I couldn't just stop by their office. So I started setting up these like Zoom, like one-on-one meetings really quick, which is just like really weird. But it is just this like weird like mindset where you are missing out on so many of those weird things, but then trying to adapt and figure out how to fill that gap. And I feel like we're all trying to like adapt the best that we can to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, one of the things we actually do is have a morning meeting, which ultimately ends up being a work meeting, but it's also a, what did you do over the weekend? How's everybody doing? Kind of touching base to sort of replace that running into people in the hallway or at the water cooler or, popping into somebody else's office and just saying, hey, how, what's up with this? And I think that helps. Sometimes it's more useful than others, and sometimes it gets very down in the weeds, work technical stuff. And sometimes it's just, hey, everybody have a good weekend.
This is Liz from IARPIC. I can definitely echo Colleen's point about one-on-ones. I came on with IARPIC 3 months ago now. And I've been remote the whole time and will continue to be remote in the future anyway. And so most of what I've been doing is setting up one-on-ones with folks because I still have not met any of my coworkers in person and probably won't for a long time. So definitely encourage folks to set up those sorts of one-on-ones. I think they're great for establishing trust and relationships.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I was actually going to introduce you to everyone and let people know that you're the sort of the manager for the IARPIC web space and the sort of tech guru for all these meetings. And I was just curious kind of what your general perspectives were on, sort of the virtual platform for getting in touch with people that, we normally have met in person with. Just kind of your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, I think, what folks have been saying in terms of it's a trade-off are really true. I saw that with the team leads workshop a month or so ago, 2 months ago. Time is strange right now, but there were folks who I understand wouldn't normally have been able to join. On the other hand, you definitely miss out on that sort of those side conversations. that happen in person. So I think trying to conscientiously create opportunities for those side conversations. So I've been trying to do things on the IRPIC platform, like do, new member intros and that kind of thing that bring people into conversations that aren't necessarily focused around a specific topic, but just encouraging folks to get to know one another. I think that's really important. And yeah, those small group or one-on-one conversations I think are really key. And if I haven't had a one-on-one with you, to anyone here, and you'd like to chat, please always reach out, because I'd love to get to know all of you way more. But yeah, like I said, I'm still pretty new, so definitely have not gotten to everyone yet.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Renee has a really interesting question in the chat that I would love to hear more about if anybody knows. So I'll read it just in case anyone's on the phone. Has there been any discussion with Quintillion regarding their fiber optic cable and connection capabilities with the communities? In talking with the emergency manager in Upyavik, he's had internet bills as high as $400 per month. Obviously, this is prohibitive to get more communities connected. So I'm wondering if anybody knows more about that. I do not.
No, I don't either. We might want to have a follow-up conversation on sort of more of those infrastructure topics. That was 2 people I invited to come and talk about those were not available on this date. So maybe we'll try and have that as part of a future meeting to talk more about sort of infrastructure for Arctic connectivity.
Yeah, and I can add to that. We've looked into getting sort of temporary hotspots, but they're also very expensive. So that's always a tricky thing as well.
And then I just wanted to know if Jackie Grebmeyer, if you might want to add a few comments, given that I know I think you had a lot of field seasons maybe planned for this year, and if you're doing sort of science collaboration or even more science research work through sort of virtual platforms that's been helpful or challenging.
Yeah, I would just say I think the Dyson is out on the water now. I'm actually a desktop 2 scientist right now, and there's a whole story for that. But in the meantime, they're having community. They're starting that up as they pass. They're just going to pass the UNIMAC, and they'll start having discussions. We already had discussions with the AWC. I did community outreach discussions on Nome and St. Lawrence Island, and had planned to do that in the fall up in the Utqiagvik until COVID came along. So I think these connections, virtually, we did this with the AWC on their call that we had in July and presented the cruise plans for that. So I think that I still think the biggest thing with the communities is to be able to get access to to people in the outside community. So I know that people in the higher up have access to the AWC, the commissioners, but there's all these different tribes that are in different parts of the coastal communities. So making sure that they're aware. So it varies between the Bering Strait region up to the North Slope region. So I think we're trying on a connections. Personally, I also think there's some getting the exact point person for the communications for the ships. I'm giving different answers on who to contact for that. So we're working through that. So we'll probably be blasting out letters to about 70 different emails to make sure we cover that people know that the ship, when it starts getting closer to the Northern Bering Sea, and particularly the discussions we've had with the AWC working off of the hunting communities. I know they have now caught successfully landed 6 of the bowheads up in Barrow and then 2 in Kaktovik. So keeping track of that. So I think that connection, this virtual is providing actually a way to reach more people, but it does show where the limitations are if they can't be wired.
Thanks. And there's a bunch of chats in the chat box. And it sounds like, yeah, there's a lot of interest in maybe having some other conversations in the future more about infrastructure and how to provide funding to make some of that happen. So I think those are all great ideas. So I think, yeah, Colleen and I and Amy will think more about that and try to maybe put another meeting together that talks about some of these topics. So we just have a few minutes left, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Are there any other closing thoughts? Anyone else that wants to provide some perspectives on what they're working with these days?
John, I was just having one more thought. And I think when Colleen was talking, I was just thinking about this as well, about how like we're all dealing with all of these immense changes, and a lot of people are working from home open-endedly. And I think one of the things that's been really helpful in the trainings that I've done, and one of the focuses that I've had, is just kind of being like as flexible as you can within your constraints, you know, and just understanding that lots of folks are working from home, and that you'll often see their kids running around in the background or a cat climbing over the computer, and just trying to be considerate as you're working through those and just mindful of others.
I think that's a great message no matter what's going on, but especially important now. So thanks for kind of leading us, ending the meeting on that note. I think that's a good one.
I think it would be sort of fun to see some of our ARPIC webinar invitations specifically say, please bring your kids, dogs, cats, because I think people are like trying to turn their video off.
We're always like pushing them aside.
yeah. And I'm like, if it was clear that like, hey, like, let's welcome this, I think that's one of the positive things that could come out of this COVID, is that, like, you know, parents especially, the more we make it normal to accept that sort of thing, the easier it will be for those of us struggling with that. So I think it would be great if IARPA collaborations could like make that one of our secret goals, is like make the kids, dogs, whatever, more welcome.
I'll say that there's Roberto from NSF again. In our most recent review panel, we actually did set aside a little time right after break for folks to introduce their family, their pets, their friends, their kids, whoever they wanted. So,
and we see that Liz has welcomed her furry child too. So
I took the opportunity, and I do think that's a really good point, Danielle, and it's something that I'll see if we can fit in on our sort of guidelines for inclusive meetings, because I think that's a key point to being inclusive.
That's great.
Thank you.
And I thought people might enjoy a dog.
Jackie, we see your cat too.
Mm-hmm.
So unsurprisingly,
all right, well, thanks so much.
I need to add to like hour 5 in a row of meetings for us. So I need to take off to our next meeting, and I have a feeling other people do too. John, do you want to take us off since you led this one?
Yeah, well, I just want to thank everyone for contributing. It was a great conversation, and thanks to the 3 folks that I had to pick on today, and for your presentations. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.